Army General's son received a harsh lesson after disrespecting Judge Caprio. The courtroom clock read 9:15 a.m., March 11th, 2025. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 12B, glinting off the polished oak benches, but the brightness did little to soften the tension hanging in the air. Ethan Brandt walked in with a measured swagger, 22 years old, shoulders squared, chest lifted as if the room had been built solely for him. His suit was sharp, Italian cut, the navy wool catching the light in a way that silently whispered wealth, influence, and entitlement. Trailing him were two military aides in crisp uniforms and his mother and father's personal advisor, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a clipboard thick with schedules and reminders. Every step Ethan took was deliberate, a small, silent claim that he belonged, that the rules bent in his favor. He didn't pause at the entryway. Instead, he moved straight toward the front, eyes scanning the gallery, acknowledging a few familiar faces of city officials and journalists with a nod that suggested connection, not courtesy. Without asking, he chose a prime seat, the one closest to the judge's bench. His father's name whispered among the security officers stationed discreetly around the room. The court clerk coughed lightly, a reminder of procedure that went unheeded. Ethan smirked faintly, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve as if to assert he was above minor formalities. Judge Caprio, 58, sat upright, his posture immaculate, hands folded over a stack of case files. The judge's dark eyes tracked Ethan, a subtle line of disapproval forming around his mouth, yet his voice remained measured. "Mr. Brandt," he said, calm, deliberate, cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. "In this courtroom, you are a citizen like any other." Ethan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. The words landed heavier than any gavel could have struck. For a brief second, he searched his entourage's faces, looking for reassurance, for a sign that this was a theatrical admonishment easily shrugged off. None came. His father's shadow loomed large in the room, and yet here, at the bench, that shadow meant nothing. Privilege had limits, and for the first time, Ethan encountered one. A silence followed, pregnant with tension. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the subtle, seismic shift. Reporters scribbled notes feverishly, their pens scratching as if each word might record history. Parents in the audience shifted their children closer to their sides. Teachers exchanged glances, and the aides beside Ethan fidgeted, unused to being ignored in a room where their military bearing usually demanded deference. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly, betraying the discomfort he had not allowed himself to feel in months. I wasn't aware," he said finally, his voice carrying a practiced calm that barely concealed a crack in his certainty. "I just—" He paused, searching for justification, for an unspoken exemption. "I mean, my father—" Judge Caprio raised a hand, halting the words before they could spill fully. "Your father's rank does not confer exemption from law or responsibility," the judge said evenly. "Respect for procedure, respect for others in this courtroom, and respect for the law are obligations you cannot delegate or purchase." The words sank in slowly. Ethan blinked, his gaze momentarily dropping to the polished floor, the weight of a statement far beyond a simple reprimand pressing down. He felt something unfamiliar: disorientation. For all his upbringing, all the signals and privileges, there was no script for being met with uncompromising impartiality. He swallowed, and the sound seemed unusually loud in the still room. Beside him, the aides exchanged uneasy glances. The mother shifted in her seat, brushing back a strand of hair nervously. Ethan's mind raced, flitting between disbelief and instinctive entitlement, attempting to map the room for potential allies, ways to bend the encounter, any small loophole that would restore the balance of power he assumed he possessed. He found none. Caprio's gaze softened slightly, though it did not waver. "In this room," he continued, voice firm but steady, "your family name carries no weight. Your achievements must be measured by action and adherence to law, not inheritance or influence. You are here to answer for your conduct, not to assert privilege." A tension rippled across the gallery. whispers started, teachers murmuring about justice, parents nodding to themselves, students scribbling thoughts on scrap paper. For the first time, the room was united not by fear of authority, but by recognition of impartiality. Ethan's entourage stiffened, the aides glancing at one another with a flicker of doubt. The veneer of untouchability had cracked. Ethan straightened, a flash of defiance crossing his features, but it lacked conviction. He opened his mouth, closed it, then exhaled sharply through his nose, realizing that a direct challenge here would only deepen the courtroom's collective scrutiny. For all his life, he had been shielded, insulated, guided, or excused. Today, none of those safeguards applied. The judge tapped a pen lightly against the desk, a subtle punctuation to the moment. "We will proceed," he said, "and you will proceed as every other citizen does, answering questions, presenting evidence, and acknowledging responsibility for your actions." Ethan nodded slowly, inwardly bracing himself. The first line had been drawn, his arrogance had collided with equality, and the collision left him unsteady. The gallery exhaled softly, a mix of anticipation and quiet approval. Outside, the city's murmurs would later capture this moment in headlines and tweets. But inside courtroom 12B, on that March morning, the battle between privilege and impartial justice had begun. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with a calm, unwavering assertion of fairness that Ethan Brandt could neither avoid nor manipulate. The stage was set. He was here as a citizen, not a general's son, and the first lesson had already begun. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly as Judge Caprio's words echoed in the quiet courtroom. "Mr. Brandt, you will address the court with proper decorum," the judge said, voice calm but unwavering. Ethan's gaze drifted lazily across the room, taking in the spectators with an air of practiced indifference. "Proper decorum," he repeated, letting the words hang, almost tasting the formality as if it were a flavor he had never acquired. Then, with a tilt of his chin and a shrug, he murmured under his breath, loud enough for a few in the front row to catch, "As if anyone actually cares about that." The whisper carried, rippling through the gallery like a small current that set off larger waves. Teachers exchanged worried glances, parents leaned forward protectively over their children, and the aides beside Ethan stiffened, shuffling papers, adjusting ties, scanning the room for a threat that didn't exist yet. Even the security officers, trained to read micro-expressions, stiffened imperceptibly, sensing the collision of arrogance and accountability about to intensify. Judge Caprio's dark eyes narrowed just slightly, and the courtroom's silence tightened around Ethan like a constricting band. "Mr. Brandt," the judge said, his voice controlled but cutting through the tension, "your tone and manner are under scrutiny not for personal offense, but for adherence to the procedural expectations that protect every individual here. Contempt is not a concept reserved for those without influence. It applies equally to all." Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time that morning. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his fingers tapping an idle rhythm against the fabric of his pants. I was just," he started, voice faltering as he searched for a way to pivot, to turn the lecture into a lesson in insignificance. I didn't mean disrespect." Judge Caprio held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Intent does not absolve impact, Mr. Brandt. Every action in this courtroom carries weight, and your behavior has already set an example for others. An example not of privilege or entitlement, but of the importance of following rules that protect citizens regardless of background." The words seemed to echo louder than the wooden benches and high ceilings could contain. Ethan felt a prickle at the back of his neck, a sensation unfamiliar and unwelcome. Privilege had always been a shield, a barrier against inconvenience, against rebuke. And yet here, in a room where the law's impartiality was enforced with quiet authority, that shield had no purchase. From the gallery, a murmured "finally" floated from an older woman, her voice barely audible. Student with a notebook jotted furiously, eyes flicking between Ethan and the judge, capturing the collision of arrogance and authority. Cameras in the press seats tilted slightly, journalists typing furiously into their phones. Caprio standards began trending within minutes, tweets and forum posts multiplying. each one dissecting the judge's calm but firm enforcement of equality. Ethan shifted in his seat, tugging at the cuff of his suit jacket, attempting to regain composure, but the tightness in his chest betrayed him. His eyes darted briefly to his aides, who now seemed tense, aware that this was no ordinary correction. Even the slight tremor in the hand of his father's advisor, as he adjusted his notes, was a signal. This was serious, not ceremonial. Judge Caprio's gaze held Ethan's, patient yet insistent. You will remember that behavior, whether in jest or sarcasm, carries consequences not because I wield authority for punishment, but because accountability is the foundation of trust. Every citizen, regardless of family name or status, is bound by the same rules. Do you understand? Yes, Ethan said, the word clipped, defensive, but also tinged with a realization that was beginning to take root. The courtroom exhaled subtly, the tension slightly eased but not gone. Ethan's arrogance had met a wall of principle, and for the first time, he was aware of the scrutiny that had always hovered just outside his insulated world. A hush fell over the room, punctuated by the quiet scratch of pens on notebooks, the faint hum of air conditioning, and the low murmur of whispered reactions. Security relaxed slightly, sensing no immediate threat, but the weight of the moment lingered. The gallery understood they had witnessed more than a rebuke. They had witnessed the tangible assertion of equality over influence. Ethan straightened in his chair, inhaling sharply through his nose, the air feeling heavier than before. His mind raced through defensive strategies, excuses, and justifications, but each felt inadequate, hollow in the face of the judge's unwavering calm. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the rules he had flouted carried real significance, and that he could not charm or intimidate his way out of the consequences they entailed. The judge paused briefly, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing with the proceedings. The incident was marked, noted, and recorded, not as a spectacle, but as a deliberate lesson in accountability. Ethan's first lesson in the boundaries of privilege was complete. The courtroom's moral scales subtly but irrevocably shifted. March 2nd, 2025, 7:43 p.m., Willow Creek Lane, Cedarfield. The fading orange light of early evening stretched across manicured lawns. Children's bicycles scattered like forgotten toys along the sidewalks. 8-year-old Maya Santos skipped stones across the concrete driveway, humming to herself, unaware that a metal storm was barreling down the narrow residential street. Her small hand clutched the worn strap of her backpack as she lined up for a hopscotch game she would never finish that day. Officer Luis Herrera, 37, was called to the scene after a neighbor reported a car speeding recklessly. He had spent 12 years on Cedarfield streets, memorizing every curve, every stop sign, every subtle hazard hidden in leafy neighborhoods. He remembered the sound of tires squealing, the precise trajectory of the vehicle, the sickening beat of adrenaline that registered when the car shot past the stop sign. The car didn't even touch the brakes until it had passed 120 feet beyond the sign. Herrera testified in the courtroom on March 12, 2025 at 10:17 a.m., almost mechanically, but his eyes betrayed the memory, the fear, the near miss, the knowledge of what could have happened. Ethan Brandt had been driving at 95 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. The courtroom was silent except for Herrera's voice, precise and clipped. Had Maya stepped forward a second sooner, it would have been catastrophic. The gallery exhaled collectively, some parents tightening grips on children's hands, some students scribbling the details feverishly. Journalists leaned forward, recording every word. The car's front bumper passed just 3 inches from her backpack, Herrera added, a pause punctuating the image. She didn't see it coming. She only heard the tires screech in a horn, and then she froze. Ana Santos, Maya's mother, a petite woman of 32 with dark circles etched from sleepless nights, took the stand next. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of reliving that evening. Since that day, she said, eyes glistening, Maya refuses to play outside. She has nightmares, jumps at every car that passes too close. I can't make her feel safe again. She pressed her hands together, knuckles whitening. She used to skip to school, waving at neighbors. Now she clings to my hand, afraid of everything. Ethan shifted in his seat, fingers tapping lightly on the mahogany surface of the defense table. His smug demeanor faltered as Anna's words painted a portrait of fear and innocence lost. He glanced toward his father's aides, seeking reassurance, their stoic expressions failing to provide any. The courtroom felt heavier, and for the first time, Ethan's family name was not a shield. Officer Herrera continued, detailing the aftermath of the incident. Immediately after the event, I received calls pressuring me to classify this as minor, citing professional courtesy. One was from Lieutenant General Marcus Brandt himself. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. I refused. I swore an oath to the law, to protect citizens, and no rank, no title, no influence would alter that. The gallery reacted, a subtle hum of murmurs, the undercurrent of rising outrage threading through parents, teachers, and ordinary citizens who had gathered. The courtroom's air felt charged, each spectator sensing the collision of privilege and accountability. One law student whispered to another, "It's not just a traffic violation, it's a moral test." Ethan's mind raced. He had assumed his father's military prestige could smooth over any misstep. That influence could erase mistakes. That wealth and connection created immunity. And yet here, in the cold precision of evidence, in the testimony of a man who refused to bend, none of that mattered. He swallowed, an unfamiliar knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. His usual charm felt ineffectual against the blunt force of consequence. Ana Santos's voice rose slightly, trembling with controlled anger. I don't want retribution, she said. I want my daughter to feel safe. I want her to know that even someone with all the power in the world cannot trample over her life and walk away. Her words hung in the courtroom like a verdict in themselves. Raw, human, undeniable. Ethan's lips pressed together, his fingers curling into fists on the table. The gravity of human cost pressed against the armor of entitlement he had always relied upon. Judge Caprio, observing the exchange, allowed the silence to linger just long enough for its moral weight to take root. Mr. Brandt, he said finally, voice measured, eyes locking on Ethan. This is more than a matter of law. It is a matter of ethics, responsibility, and conscience. Every citizen, regardless of lineage or privilege, is bound to protect the vulnerable. That obligation cannot be deferred or diluted. Ethan exhaled sharply, his arrogance deflating as if air had been removed from a balloon. The courtroom's collective gaze bore down on him, not in judgment of status, but in recognition of expectation, accountability, and justice. The evidence was irrefutable. The near disaster, the emotional trauma, and the attempted manipulation of the investigative process. Privilege had collided with principle, and the collision left Ethan exposed. Outside, reporters began posting live updates. Washuk's Caprio standards trending within minutes. Social media feeds lit up with outrage, empathy, and analysis. The near tragedy of Willow Creek Lane was no longer a private incident. It was a public reckoning, a test of whether influence could override moral obligation. Inside the courtroom, Ethan slouched slightly, awareness dawning that the stakes were no longer theoretical. The boy who had once assumed he could bend rules to his will was now confronted with the immovable weight of responsibility, human cost, and systemic integrity. The gallery murmured quietly, the tension shifting, a new understanding settling over Cedarfield. This case was no longer about a reckless driver. It was about the boundaries of power, the courage of those who enforce the law, and the lives that hang in the balance when arrogance collides with consequence. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the witness stand, where Maya Santos, small and resolute, gripped the edge of the podium with both hands. Her eyes were wide, dark pools that seemed to measure him, not with anger, but with the raw clarity of someone who had seen the edge of danger and refused to be swallowed by it. You don't get to scare my life away, she said, her voice soft but piercing, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of nights spent trembling under blankets, the sound of brakes scraping still ringing in her ears. The courtroom froze. A pin dropped somewhere near the back, but no one noticed. Ethan's smirk evaporated, replaced by a tightening in his jaw and a flutter of unease behind his eyes. His father's aides shifted, uncomfortable in their starched suits, glancing at each other as if hoping someone else would step in to diffuse the impact. Judge Caprio, seated with the serene authority that had come to define him, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the words to embed themselves in the conscience of everyone present. Officer Luis Herrera cleared his throat. "This isn't the only incident," he said, his voice low but precise. "Over the past 12 months, Mr. Brandt has been reported in 3 other near-collision events in residential areas. Each time, witnesses noted excessive speed, aggressive maneuvering, and minimal regard for pedestrians. Each time, pressure was applied to classify these as minor infractions due to connections." He let the implication hang, the gallery leaning in collectively, absorbing the dimensions of the recklessness shielded by status. Ana Santos took a shuddering breath. "We are just one family," she said, her voice trembling. "But there are many children in Cedarfield who rely on drivers like him to be careful, to follow the rules. It's not just about law, it's about life, about trust." Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, and Maya reached up instinctively to squeeze her mother's hand, grounding herself against the tide of emotion. The public gallery responded in subtle waves, soft gasps, shifting in their seats, a few heads nodding in grim understanding. Students from the local high school, invited to observe ethics and civics in practice, scribbled fervently in their notebooks. One whispered, "It's not just speed, it's entitlement." Across the courtroom, journalists typed rapidly, capturing Maya's words, Herrera's testimony, and the emotional resonance that bridged the law and the human consequences. Social media feeds lit up with hashtags, with parents recounting similar near misses in their neighborhoods, and threads of discussion appeared overnight. Human cost, Jari Cedarfield safety, Chakan Caprio justice. Ethan's mind raced. He could recall every day of privilege, every assumption that the law bent to the powerful, every shortcut earned with influence rather than merit. And yet here, framed by a child's unwavering honesty and an officer's meticulous account, those assumptions crumbled. The armor of entitlement felt suddenly brittle. He glanced at the floor, noting the polished marble that reflected the light of the courtroom. Clean, precise, impartial. No family name, no rank, no money could alter the plain truth laid bare before him. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped, voice steady and deliberate. "The law does not differentiate based on rank, inheritance, or influence. It exists to protect all citizens equally and to uphold the trust that binds a community together. When one life is endangered, it diminishes us all, not just the immediate victim." The courtroom absorbed the statement in heavy silence, the weight of principle sinking in, undeniable, concrete. A schoolteacher in the audience wiped a tear quietly, thinking of her own students walking home along streets lined with speeding cars. A neighbor who had once waved at Ethan's father in friendly recognition now felt a twinge of betrayal, not at the Brandts themselves, but at the assumption that privilege could excuse harm. Across social media, the sentiment mirrored the courtroom's energy. Collective outrage, yes, but also reflection, an awakening of ethical responsibility, a dialogue forming around the obligations owed to those who cannot shield themselves. Maya's small voice, unyielding, remained in the air even as testimony continued. "You don't get to scare my life away," she repeated softly, almost to herself, a mantra that crystallized the moral center of the proceedings. Ethan's fingers curled tightly into fists, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, each inhale carrying a dawning awareness. Consequences could not be negotiated, morality could not be circumvented, and human cost was not something that status could erase. As the judge prepared to move into the next segment of the case, the courtroom's energy had shifted irrevocably. The spectacle of privilege had collided with the human reality of vulnerability. And in that collision, the ethical stakes of Cedarfield streets and of its justice system became undeniable. Ethan would leave the courtroom that day with the knowledge that recklessness had a face, a voice, and a lasting echo far beyond any ticket or fine. March 3, 2025, 8:02 a.m., Cedarfield Police Headquarters. The morning light slanted across gray concrete and glass. But inside the Internal Affairs Office, the atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating. Officers gathered, hesitant, glancing at one another, fingers tapping pens against folders, minds replaying conversations they had tried to forget. Every message, every call, every suggestion to keep things quiet had been a test of integrity. Lieutenant Sarah Mehta, 41 career investigator, stepped to the stand in courtroom 12B on March 13, 2025, at 9:24 a.m., her voice measured but carrying the weight of moral urgency. Between March 2nd and March 5th, she said, sliding a series of printed call logs across the evidence table, we documented no fewer than 7 calls from Lieutenant General Marcus Brandt directly to Cedarfield police officials. Each call suggested adjustments, minimize the report, highlight mitigating factors, and, in one instance, omit the child's close encounter entirely. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. The courtroom was silent, yet tense, as if every ear strained to capture the full implication. Officer Luis Herrera, who had testified about the near disaster with Maya Santos, leaned forward. His voice, steady but slightly rigid, added detail that made the attempts at influence tangible. I received one call at 10:46 p.m., March the 2nd, from an unknown number, later confirmed to be the general's aide. The request was explicit, framed the incident as minor. That same night, internal emails circulated among Ethan Brandt's advisors discussing strategies to minimize headlines and protect the family's reputation. He lifted a folder toward the judge, the corners slightly dog-eared, proof that even bureaucratic records could not be erased. The gallery reacted with murmurs. Students from local high schools scribbled furiously in notebooks, their pens chasing the unfolding narrative of power tested against principle. Reporters tapped rapidly on laptops, social media feeds flaring with early coverage. How could systemic privilege, Nadir Caprio integrity? Parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, imagining what would happen if these tactics went unchallenged in their own neighborhoods. Ethan, seated at the defense table, clenched his jaw. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes as he realized the narrative was expanding beyond a single reckless act. This was not about speed or a near miss. This was about the machinery of influence, the deliberate attempt to shield misconduct, to bend rules without consequence. For the first time, his inherited immunity was being confronted not just by law, but by transparency. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the hum of reaction, calm yet unmistakably firm. Attempts to interfere with professional duties, to distort reports, to shield individuals from accountability, erode public trust. They corrode the foundations of justice itself. He let the statement hang, observing the tightening of Ethan's shoulders, the pale flush creeping across aides' faces. Privilege does not grant immunity. Influence does not excuse dishonesty. Integrity, once compromised, diminishes us all. Ana Santos, sitting quietly with Maya at her side, felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. Witnessing the officers testify with unwavering adherence to procedure, despite the pressure, brought a sense of vindication. It also exposed the stark contrast between power unaccountable and individuals committed to duty. Her eyes met Herrera's briefly, a silent nod exchanged, gratitude for steadfastness, relief that at least some guardians of justice remained unswayed. The courtroom's attention oscillated between Ethan, whose bravado was increasingly hollow, and the officers presenting the evidence. Internal emails were read aloud, phrases like minimize impact and suppress attention echoing unnervingly. The gallery reacted in unison, disbelief, anger, and a dawning understanding that this was more than a traffic incident. It was a microcosm of systemic privilege attempting to rewrite consequences. A student whispered to another, barely audible, "It's not just one reckless kid, it's the whole apparatus around him." Reporters noted it too, realizing the story's complexity. Cedarfield was watching a reckoning of authority, ethics, and influence unfold in real time. Judge Caprio's gaze swept across the courtroom one final time, lingering on Ethan. Accountability cannot be negotiated. Every effort to obscure the truth, every call to sway outcome, will be documented and weighed. Justice does not bend for rank or connection. You will learn this, and so will the community. Ethan's hand twitched slightly on the polished wood of the defense table. He could no longer rely on the invisible shield of his father's position, the echo chamber of aides whispering assurances. The walls of privilege were cracking, not from law alone, but from the combined force of ethical principle, public scrutiny, and human witness. Outside, the city stirred. Social media lit up. Parents discussed ethics lessons in schools. Neighborhood forums debated the weight of influence versus integrity. And journalists penned stories emphasizing the systemic implications. Cedarfield was not merely observing a courtroom drama. It was confronting the broader truth that unchecked power could endanger not only individual lives, but the trust upon which society relied. Inside, Ethan sat rigid, absorbing the confrontation in silence. The realization was inescapable. Privilege could no longer shield recklessness, and influence could no longer mask human cost. For the first time, the weight of moral and societal accountability pressed directly upon him. The battle lines between entitlement and justice had been drawn, and the consequences were already unfolding. Ethan Brandt's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the witness stand on March 14, 2025, at 10:37 a.m. in Courtroom 12B. The morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the courtroom in stark, almost accusing clarity. Every eye was on him: lawyers, Judge Caprio, gallery, and journalists whose pens and cameras captured each twitch, each pause. The air carried the weight of expectation, and for the first time, the inherited shield of privilege felt impossibly thin. Officer Luis Herrera's testimony had concluded minutes earlier, detailing the injuries sustained by Maya Santos and the hours of therapy her parents had painstakingly arranged. Herrera's voice, calm and precise, had described the tiny details Ethan had never considered. The uneven gait, the reluctance to play in the yard, the panic at the sound of speeding engines. Now Ethan was alone under the scrutiny of consequences he could no longer deny. Judge Caprio's gaze was unwavering, yet patient, allowing the moment to sink in. "Mr. Brandt," he said quietly, "the facts before this court are clear. Your actions endangered a child. Your response to that endangerment will demonstrate your understanding of responsibility, or the lack thereof." Ethan swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He had rehearsed lines in his head countless times, expecting legal arguments to shield him, expecting clever phrasing to soften the moral weight. But now confronted with Maya's mother, Ana Santos, who sat rigid yet composed, and the child who stared at him with wide, unspeaking eyes, rehearsed defenses evaporated. I wasn't thinking," he said, voice cracking mid-sentence. His polished composure faltered. The arrogance that had accompanied him into the courthouse the previous week was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made the room shift. "I know it doesn't matter, and I can't undo what I did. I can't take it back." His gaze flicked toward Maya, who fidgeted with the hem of her school uniform, then back to her mother. The physical distance between them was measured in feet, but the emotional chasm seemed insurmountable. Judge Caprio leaned forward, fingers lightly folded. "Acknowledgement is a start, Mr. Brandt, but words alone are insufficient. The law, and morality, requires tangible responsibility." Ethan's shoulders sagged as if the weight of every privileged choice he had ever relied upon pressed upon him. The courtroom remained quiet, save for the faint scratching of pens and the soft hum of cameras capturing the moment. The silence forced introspection. He could no longer view his actions as isolated, nor see the world as a stage where consequences applied only to others. "I want to make this right," he said, voice steadier, but still tinged with shame. "I'll fund Maya's therapy sessions, cover the costs she's endured. I'll work with the school to organize safety programs, and I'll learn from Officer Herrera, from those who understand responsibility, how to act differently." He exhaled sharply, a long, trembling breath, as the words left him with an authenticity that silenced the gallery. Ana Santos' eyes glistened, not with anger now, but with cautious relief. That, that matters, she said softly, her voice carrying across the hushed room. But it's more than money, Ethan. You have to see the consequences, not just pay for them. You have to understand them. Murmurs ran quietly through the audience. The courtroom's collective pulse had shifted. The case was no longer about privilege or entitlement. It had reached the emotional core, the moral reckoning. Journalists quickly keyed in the pivotal lines for social media. Just your Caprio conscience. Your accountability matters. Outside, the city would watch, dissect, and debate. Inside, the transformation was unfolding in real time. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, letting the weight of Ethan's admission resonate. Acknowledgement paired with restitution, he said, is the first step toward ethical accountability. The court will monitor the fulfillment of these obligations. Your journey toward understanding and repair begins here, but it is only a beginning. Ethan's father, General Marcus Brandt, sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes shadowed with a mix of pride, fear, and reluctant acceptance. The notion that his son could be guided by principle rather than inheritance challenged years of cultivated expectation. Yet as he observed the sincerity in Ethan's posture and the weight of the court's moral authority, even the general recognized the necessity of this reckoning. Ethan glanced at Officer Herrera, the mentor figure who had stood unwaveringly against pressure and influence. Herrera's eyes were steady, silent encouragement in every line of his face. There was no pity, only expectation. The expectation that Ethan would follow through, that moral responsibility could not be faked, that growth would require effort, humility, and time. The gallery exhaled as one. The tension dissipated slightly, replaced by a contemplative quiet. The case had shifted from technical violation to human reckoning, from a legal assessment to a moral dialogue. The courtroom had become a mirror, reflecting the fragile intersection of power and conscience, the stark contrast between privilege and ethical accountability. Ethan's first steps toward restitution had begun, and for the first time, he was forced to see the breadth of his actions, the fragility of trust, and the necessity of consistent, tangible change. It was not punishment alone that defined the moment. It was awareness, humility, and the willingness to repair harm. The emotional pivot had arrived. The moral center of the story had been claimed, and the path forward, though uncertain, was illuminated by accountability. The courtroom was unusually still on May 20th, 2025 at exactly 2:35 p.m. A heavy, almost tangible anticipation filled the air in courtroom 12B of the Cedarfield Justice Complex. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching on polished wooden benches and the brass nameplate of Judge Caprio, casting long shadows across the tile floor. Every eye in the gallery, from concerned neighbors to journalists armed with smartphones and notebooks, was fixed on the bench. The silence was a collective holding of breath, a city waiting for a declaration that would ripple far beyond these walls. Ethan Brandt sat rigidly, hands folded tightly on his lap, his tailored suit slightly creased from hours of tension. His earlier bravado, the entitlement that had once accompanied him like a shield, was gone. Now there was only apprehension, the uncomfortable weight of knowing. That status and influence could no longer bend consequences. Even General Marcus Brandt, seated in the front row with his face set in tight lines, seemed to shrink in the shadow of ethical clarity, realizing for the first time that power could not insulate his son from accountability. Judge Caprio's voice, steady and commanding, broke the silence. Ethan Brandt, he began, each syllable deliberate, your actions on March 2nd, 2025, demonstrated a profound disregard for the safety of others. 8-year-old Maya Santos, along with her peers and families, were placed at risk by your recklessness. The law demands accountability. The community demands accountability. You will not evade responsibility through rank, lineage, or influence. He paused, letting the words settle, allowing Ethan and everyone watching to feel the gravity of the moment. The room absorbed the weight of the statement, the gallery's collective tension rising in subtle waves. You will pay $75,000 in restitution to the families affected, Judge Caprio continued, an amount reflecting the tangible harm endured, medical care, therapy, and educational disruptions. You will complete 250 hours of supervised community service, teaching traffic safety in the schools along Willow Creek Lane and surrounding neighborhoods. And finally, for 6 months, you will participate in direct mentorship under Officer Luis Herrera, whose commitment to public safety and ethical enforcement stands as a model you must now follow. The words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan's hands tightened, his knuckles whitening, as he tried to process the sequence of consequences. His eyes widened, darting to his father, searching for an anchor that wasn't there. The general exhaled, jaw taut, the rigid pride of years yielding to the understanding that even wealth, even rank, could not rewrite moral law. The courtroom murmured quietly, an undercurrent of relief and awe, the recognition that justice had been neither arbitrary nor vindictive. This was a sentence crafted with intention, a synthesis of punitive action, symbolic restitution, and instructive guidance. Teaching children in the streets where he had endangered them was not merely punishment, it was moral recalibration, a tangible confrontation with the consequences of his actions. Paying the restitution was more than money. It was acknowledgement of real, measurable harm inflicted on innocent lives. And mentorship with Officer Herrera promised structured moral growth, bridging theory and lived responsibility. Ethan's gaze fell to the gallery, where families affected by his actions sat quietly. Some held tissues, others exchanged glances of guarded satisfaction. The weight of observation, the knowledge that his transformation would be publicly witnessed, bore down on him. His voice was almost inaudible as he muttered, "I understand." It was not an excuse, not a plea, but the first step toward tangible contrition. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, fingers interlaced. Let this sentence serve as a reminder. Accountability is inseparable from privilege. Wealth and influence do not exempt one from ethical responsibility. Justice is not simply the enforcement of law. It is the instruction of conscience, the cultivation of humility, and the restoration of trust. The gallery exhaled collectively. Some nodded subtly, some wiped away tears. Social media feeds, already alive with commentary, spiked with Shirin's keynote on Caprio justice and accountability trend, as citizens across Cedarfield and beyond reacted to the layered, thoughtful sentence. Teachers discussed it in lesson plans, parents referenced it with their children, journalists analyzed it as a rare example of measured judicial power meeting moral clarity. Ethan's shoulders slumped, the tension bleeding from his frame as the reality of months of service, public scrutiny, and ethical monitoring sank in. For the first time, he felt the weight of consequences as inseparable from his actions, a tangible measure of the harm he had caused and the work required to repair it. Outside the courtroom, community members lingered in quiet conversation, reflecting on the symbolism of a sentence that balanced law, morality, and instruction. This was a moment that would reverberate far beyond Cedarfield's city limits, a case study in how privilege could meet accountability and how structured restitution could catalyze personal transformation. Judge Caprio's voice, steady and enduring, closed the session. Let the obligations begin, let the learning begin, let the healing begin. The first drops of June rain fell on Cedarfield just before 6:30 a.m., mist curling along the cracked asphalt of Willow Creek Lane. Ethan Brandt, once accustomed to arriving late in his black SUV, now walked the wet streets under a gray sky, his tailored suit replaced with a reflective safety vest and worn sneakers, clutching a clipboard damp from the drizzle. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from the rain but from the weight of responsibility he could no longer evade. The neighborhood, still whispering about the court sentence from May, watched cautiously as the son of a powerful Army general assumed the role of student and teacher simultaneously, a living lesson in accountability. Officer Luis Herrera, standing tall in his standard-issue uniform despite the drizzle, greeted him without warmth but without condescension. "Morning, Brandt. You ready?" Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, sir," he said, the words tasting strange on his tongue, unfamiliar in their humility. Their first task was overseeing the school's morning traffic drill. Children lined the sidewalk in bright raincoats, umbrellas bobbing, eyes wide with curiosity. Some whispered about the young man who had terrified their streets weeks ago. Others merely stared, unsure if the figure in the vest would command respect or stumble under scrutiny. Ethan took a deep breath, signaling the first group to cross safely, guiding them with precise, careful instructions. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of someone newly aware that authority without accountability is nothing. By midweek, Ethan was repairing a broken playground swing set at Cedarfield Elementary. Splintered wood and rusted chains were reminders of neglect, but also opportunities for constructive work. Children gathered nearby, some teasing at first, others observing silently. When he knelt to tighten bolts, his hands scraped, and his muscles ached in ways that his wealth had never previously demanded. Every sore joint, every drop of rain in his eyes reminded him that privilege was irrelevant when action mattered. The small gestures mattered. When a teen stumbled during a crossing drill, Ethan caught the boy's arm without hesitation. "Watch your step," he said, soft but firm. The boy blinked, eyes widening in a mixture of surprise and respect. These moments, fleeting yet meaningful, began reshaping the narrative of Ethan Brandt in the neighborhood. He was no longer a name on social media trending with outrage. He was a presence, tangible and accountable. At one point, a teacher approached, notebook in hand, watching him carefully. "You've been here every day on time," she said quietly. "No shortcuts, no excuses. The kids notice." Ethan nodded, a subtle warmth spreading in his chest at the validation. For the first time, recognition was not inherited, but earned. The feeling was unfamiliar, yet grounding, and it prompted self-reflection. He had always assumed that actions, no matter how reckless, could be smoothed over by influence. Now every correct procedure, every safety instruction, demanded personal investment. Some mornings were tougher than others. Rain seeped through his sleeves during drills, hands blistered from playground repairs. Teens questioned his authority with sharp words and skeptical glares. Each moment of resistance tested not his pride, but his patience, forcing a confrontation with inner arrogance. Frustration came quickly, a burning in his chest at first instinct to retreat, to dismiss, to assert entitlement. But the memory of Maya Santos, of her mother's weary gaze, of the public reckoning in May, kept him steady. Each challenge became a lesson. The work of redemption was neither immediate nor easy, and no shortcut could replace consistent effort. Community response began to shift subtly. Parents nodded in passing. Children who had once whispered warnings began to seek his guidance. Officer Herrera, watching from a distance, noted the change with quiet satisfaction. The work was arduous, but tangible transformation emerged in the rhythm of repeated action. Week after week, Ethan's presence became a fixture, not a spectacle, and slowly, skepticism softened into cautious trust. By late September, Cedarfield Elementary's playground gleamed, freshly painted and repaired, sidewalks clear and crosswalks monitored meticulously. Ethan, soaked from another morning drizzle, glanced around at the neighborhood. Teachers offered brief smiles, children waved as they passed safely to school, and neighbors nodded in acknowledgement. Not praise, but recognition of effort. Each day's labor had chipped away at the public memory of arrogance, revealing accountability, humility, and ethical commitment in its place. Through the physical fatigue and emotional strain, Ethan found clarity. Privilege could no longer shield him, but sustained action could teach responsibility. Every drop of rain, every blistered hand, every small moment of guidance was a thread in the fabric of his redemption. By September, it was clear. Redemption was not a single court verdict, nor a public statement, nor a social media trend. It was the sum of repeated honest action, the intersection of accountability and ethical growth. And as he walked home one misty afternoon, watching children cross safely under his careful instructions, Ethan understood that the path ahead was long, that transformation was incremental, and that real justice lived in the work done after the gavel fell. September mornings in Cedarfield carried a different energy. The streets along Willow Creek Lane were alive with children walking confidently to school, backpacks bouncing, umbrellas twirling, their laughter no longer tinged with fear. Months of accountability, effort, and consistent service had begun to ripple outward, leaving impressions that even the smallest residents could sense. Where once the memory of Ethan Brandt's reckless driving shadowed their footsteps, now there was a cautious optimism, a sense that actions could truly matter, that consequences were not abstract, and that public reckoning could transform behavior. At Cedarfield Elementary, the expanded traffic safety program had grown from a small demonstration into a full curriculum. Officer Herrera, with Ethan assisting, oversaw lessons on pedestrian safety, signaling, and emergency awareness. Students raised hands confidently, asking questions that reflected understanding beyond rote rules. "What would you do if a car ran a stop sign?" one student asked. Ethan crouched to eye level with the fourth grader. "Step back, call for help, stay calm, and remember you have a voice. Safety isn't just rules, it's responsibility," he said. His voice carried authority, tempered now with humility, and the room absorbed it differently than it might have months earlier. Parents at drop-off paused in conversation, some glancing at Ethan as he directed a group across the street. "He's here every morning, rain or shine," remarked one mother, adjusting her scarf. "I didn't think he'd last a week, but he's changed." Another parent nodded, tension lines softening as they watched their children navigate the crosswalk with steady guidance. The community, once divided between outrage and resignation, now measured growth by daily observable actions. Conversations at PTA meetings, neighborhood forums, and online parent groups regularly referenced Ethan's transformation as a real-world example of responsibility, restitution, and integrity. Local journalists who had followed the story from the first courtroom exchanges now reported differently. Articles highlighted progress, chronicling Ethan's 250 hours of supervised community service, mentorship under Officer Herrera, and specific incidents where children credited him with restoring their confidence in public safety. Social media posts reflected cautious approval, hashtags like Cedarfield Change and Restorative Justice, trending locally as people debated what true accountability meant. Even law students from nearby universities visited for observations, notebooks open, analyzing the case as a model of ethical enforcement paired with redemption, dissecting how consistent action reinforced community trust more effectively than punitive measures alone. Ethan himself felt the cumulative weight of these months. Early mornings under drizzle, repetitive instructions, and physical exhaustion had cultivated a rhythm of diligence he had never known. He noted the small signs, the hesitant first step across the street replaced by decisive movement, smiles replacing nervous glances, and teachers acknowledging improvements in confidence and safety awareness. Each interaction reinforced that redemption was iterative, never instant, and that communal trust required patience, visibility, and humility. Conversations in homes echoed this shift. Parents referenced the case when discussing ethics with children. "Remember Ethan Brandt?" a father asked his teenage son while fixing breakfast. "He made mistakes, faced consequences, and worked to make them right. That's what responsibility looks like." Teenagers, inspired by discussions at school and in online forums, debated civic responsibility, the role of privilege, and the impact of consistent ethical behavior. Community elders, once skeptical of the judiciary's reach, now recognized the broader social lesson. Accountability, when paired with meaningful action, had the power to influence norms, behavior, and interpersonal trust. The tangible and intangible ripple effects intertwined. Teachers noted improved attentiveness during safety drills. Children walked to school with renewed assurance, and neighbors reported being more vigilant during commutes. The trial, once a flashpoint of outrage, became a reference point for civic engagement, an ethical compass for how the community measured fairness, integrity, and communal responsibility. Discussions among law students, ethics scholars, and local volunteers emphasized that justice was no longer merely punitive, but social, bridging the gap between law and lived moral experience. Ethan watched from the crosswalk as a group of third graders safely navigated the street, their conversation peppered with questions he answered, patiently, carefully, fully aware that every response reinforced more than knowledge. It reinforced trust. He realized that transformation was not solely his own. It belonged to the children, their families, and the community he had wronged. Each smile, each nod, Each conversation reflected a society healing incrementally, proving that justice extended beyond the gavel, embedding itself into behaviors, norms, and the moral fabric of Cedarfield. As morning gave way to mid-morning, sunlight breaking through the lingering drizzle, Ethan paused, notebook in hand, and observed the rhythm of a community steadily reclaiming safety and confidence. The work was far from complete, but the foundation of ethical engagement had taken hold. The city streets were no longer haunted by reckless disregard. They carried the echoes of accountability, service, and reflection. The ripple effects of justice, painstakingly earned and continually enacted, were now visible in every cautious step, every responsible gesture, every conversation that reminded citizens that actions, consequences, and ethical commitment were inseparable. October 14th, 2025, 9:07 a.m. Cedarfield felt quieter than usual. The brisk autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves along Main Street, a reminder that seasons shifted, and with them, perspectives. In courtroom 12B, Judge Caprio adjusted the papers before him, a calm certainty resting on his shoulders. The room, once tense with confrontation and whispered anticipation, now held a contemplative silence, a rare pause that felt more profound than any verdict or admonition. Ethan Brandt, seated near the front, watched the morning sunlight glint off the courtroom windows, his reflection faint on the polished mahogany, a mirrored image of someone changed, tempered, yet still learning the weight of responsibility. Caprio's voice broke the silence. Justice, he began, is never simply a matter of law. It is ethical, social, and emotional. It is felt in the trust we place in one another, in the accountability we uphold when privilege tempts us to evade consequence. Ethan swallowed, his hands folded tightly, knuckles white, the memory of earlier shame and subsequent labor still raw in muscle and conscience. He thought of the early mornings, the drizzle-soaked crosswalks, the dozens of children who had learned to look both ways and speak up, the families who had entrusted him with their fear and their hope. In the public gallery, neighbors, teachers, and journalists murmured softly, their gazes thoughtful. One elderly teacher leaned toward another, whispering, "I never imagined he'd actually show up every day, but look at the difference. Children are walking taller." A law student, notebook open, scribbled observations furiously, capturing the arc from reckless entitlement to deliberate restitution. "It's remarkable," she said, voice low, "to see a case where moral courage reshapes behavior rather than simply punishing it." Caprio continued, directing his attention to Ethan. "You have learned that privilege carries a responsibility heavier than ordinary consequence. It tests not just obedience to law, but the courage to face ethical and social duties without reservation." Ethan's gaze flickered toward the gallery. He imagined Ana Santos, her eyes steady during every court appearance, her voice unwavering when speaking of Maya's fear. He thought of Officer Herrera, who had guided him with relentless patience, embodying the principle that justice requires both firmness and guidance. The judge's words hung in the room, resonating with every witness, parent, and bystander who had witnessed this slow transformation. Public trust, Caprio added, is built not in headlines, not in symbolic gestures alone, but in consistent, tangible action. It is restored incrementally through humility, diligence, and honesty. And it is the responsibility of every individual to reinforce these standards, regardless of social status or connections. Ethan nodded subtly, understanding that this reflection was not a rhetorical flourish, but a blueprint for life beyond the courtroom. His past arrogance, once a shield, now felt like a heavy cloak removed in stages, leaving him exposed to both scrutiny and opportunity. The opportunity to contribute meaningfully, ethically, socially. He realized that the lectures he delivered to school children, the hours spent repairing playgrounds, the careful mentorship under Herrera, were not punishments. They were instruments of societal repair. In the gallery, a young student raised her hand, timid but curious. "Judge Caprio, does justice always change the community?" Caprio's eyes softened, and he considered the question carefully. "It can," he said, but only if we allow accountability to extend beyond individual punishment. Justice becomes transformational when restitution, responsibility, and moral courage intersect, guiding behavior, restoring trust, and inspiring collective integrity. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. Every early morning, every weary hand extended to teach, every small gesture toward safety had contributed to this philosophical outcome. Journalists scribbled notes capturing the essence. Justice as a living process, a societal compass. Parents left the gallery discussing ethics at the breakfast table, conversations ranging from responsibility and privilege to community engagement. In classrooms, teachers introduced the Brandt case as an example of moral courage and the systemic value of accountability. Even casual conversations on sidewalks reflected a subtle shift. Individuals now felt more empowered to act ethically, knowing that their choices mattered. Caprio concluded, his tone measured, reflective, yet resonant. One case, if handled with integrity, can guide public conscience. It can inspire societal reflection and create enduring moral frameworks. It reminds us that actions have consequences, privileges carry obligations, and accountability, when paired with consistency, restores not just trust, but the ethical heartbeat of a community. Ethan exhaled slowly, his reflection in the courtroom glass no longer a stranger. He felt the quiet weight of responsibility, the permanence of change, and the echo of justice that extended far beyond him, beyond the courtroom, and into the very streets, schools, and homes of Cedarfield. One reckless choice had become a lesson in power, morality, and redemption, and the city, having witnessed both fault and repair, would carry the resonance of that lesson for years to come.